Hey there everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk to you about rereading my favorite book series of all time. For anybody who's not new to this channel, you probably know that my favorite book series is Vampire Academy by Richelle Mead. It is, I've said it before, my life's blood. And I mean, I have reread these books before many times, but for some reason this time, as I've been reading through the series, I've just been noticing a lot of things that either I never noticed before, or even if I did notice them, they didn't stand out to me as much as they are this time around. And I don't know if that's because when I started rereading this series, I was in the middle of revisions for my book, and so just errors were kind of popping out at me because that's just the space my brain was in. I don't know if that was it or what, but I did start noticing a lot more errors than I've ever noticed before in my many rereads of this series. And honestly, in noticing these errors that I never noticed before, I feel like I've kind of learned a lesson. But first I want to talk about what errors I have been finding, and then I will get to the meat of what this video is about. So the first thing that I noticed a lot of in these books that I never noticed before were there are so many typos. I will say, it's not so bad that it makes the books seem amateur or whatever. It's not like there's multiple on a single page. They're scattered throughout the books, but there are way more than I expected there to be, and way more than I am used to seeing in a traditionally published book. Now, I don't know if all of these typos are still in the books. Like, I, for the first 3 books at least, have these ones, you know, the very original paperback copies with the models who barely look like the characters they're supposed to be representing. These are the books I have, and these are like first print versions of the books. So maybe in future prints, many, if not all, of the typos that I've been noticing were eradicated. I have no idea, but in the version I was reading, so many typos. And by this I mean either misspelled words, or sometimes there was duplicated words that weren't meant to be duplicated. Sometimes there was that thing, do you ever have that where you're writing a line and then you change your mind about what you're trying to say, so then you rewrite it a different way, but then later you go back and when you're revising you find a word from the initial phrasing of that line before you rephrased it, like almost like you just forgot to get rid of it. Do you know what I mean? Because that happened a couple of times in these books. There were also a couple of instances of missing words that, like, initially my eyes skimmed over and then something in my brain was like, wait, and then I went back and I reread the line and I was like, oh, there's a word missing here. Like, my brain filled it in for me, but like that word is not there. So yeah, that happened a few times too. And I guess it just surprised me because, again, that's not something that I really notice lately in traditionally published books, in some of the newer books that I've been reading, but maybe my eyes have just been skimming over them. You know, apparently I read these books multiple times and never caught them, so maybe it's happening with all the other books I'm reading too. Like, who the hell knows? The next thing I noticed a decent amount of were some plot holes and inconsistencies. And the biggest inconsistency that I noticed that, like, for some reason stretches throughout multiple books is this mention of Rose basically beating the shit out of Jesse, the asshole character, for being an asshole. And I'm like, that never happened. And it's weird because it's not just like in the first book, you know, maybe like Richelle Mead wrote the scene where Rose actually did beat him up, but then she edited and revised it and changed it so that Rose walks away from the fight instead, which is what happened in the book. But then she forgot within that book to change that reference later that says that Rose beat the crap out of him. Like, maybe that's what happened, but I just don't understand how that could explain multiple books later her still referencing that instance that never happened. It just kind of confounds me. I'm so confused about how that got past editing. I don't it doesn't make sense to me. Similarly, there was this point, I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm going to say this in the least spoilery way I can. In the third book, Rose talks to a ghost. And so in the very beginning of the fourth book, which I just started my reread of, Rose says that this ghost told her that this person she's looking for is in Siberia. But he didn't. That's the thing. The ghost did not say that this guy she's looking for is in Siberia. The ghost did answer some of her questions about the guy she's looking for, but she even says at the end of the third book, I know distinctly that she said something like, "You can't lead me to him, can you?" And the ghost says, well, he like shakes his head like, "No, I can't." And she's like, "That's fine. I think I know where he is anyway." Those are the lines that happen in that book. And yet somehow in the fourth book she's like, "Yeah, the ghost told me he's in Siberia, but he couldn't like bring me all the way. He couldn't give me more specifics." I'm like, he never said Siberia. He never even nodded or shook his head to the word Siberia. So like, and it's just stuff like that. Like, I'm like, how did that get missed? I don't know, it's just confusing to me, and that kind of stuff has been really standing out to me in this particular reread of the series. Another thing I noticed, and this isn't the biggest thing in the world, but I did notice it, it's that there were a lot of times where there are repeated words within the same paragraph. Now, I'm not talking about the typo thing where there's like a duplicate word. I'm talking about, for example, there's this part in the third book that goes, "They apparently had a more formal bodyguard relationship. Jesse and Ralph hadn't been in line when we arrived, but they'd apparently wandered up." So she used apparently twice within the same paragraph and also within like 2 sentences. And those sentences like followed each other. Boom, boom, exactly how I just read it. And again, that's not the biggest deal in the world, but that is something that in my own revisions I've been working to cut out because I just don't like how that sounds. And I've heard just in general a lot of people saying like, yeah, when you revise you kind of cut stuff like that, you reword things because it sounds repetitive and it kind of ruins the flow of the sentences. I guess it just kind of bothered me because in my mind I'm like, that's stuff that I myself am cutting out in my editing, like self-editing my own work, and like a professional editor didn't even call that out. It just kind of, I guess, caught my attention, especially because it happens so often within all of her books. Like, she could have totally just cut that second actually and it would have sounded great. Like, the paragraph would have sounded fine. So, yeah, that's just something that caught my eye. And then the final thing that I noticed is that a lot of the dialogue in these books is very awkward, and I think that's something that I've kind of always known because back in the day, I used to take scenes from these books and act them out with me as Rose Hathaway, and I'd do them as kind of monologues. And first of all, they were bad just because I was not a good actress. I made a video of myself reacting to these videos. If you want to watch it, it's up there, linked in the cards. It's cringy. You've been warned. I could barely get through it. But yeah, part of it was just bad because I was not a great actress, but also I was trying to read some of them to myself this time around just to see if like, because I know that my acting has gotten better. But even still, the flow of some of the dialogue is just incredibly unnatural and unrealistic. And so no matter how you try to say it, it's kind of like, you know, when you watch movies and there's just a line that you're like, there's like the best actor in the world could not have said that line in a way that sounded natural. That's how a lot of the dialogue in these books are. And I mean, I kind of feel like that's a common pitfall for a lot of books. I feel like book dialogue tends to read differently than real life dialogue, or even differently than film dialogue. But dialogue is a very important thing to me in my writing specifically. I read my books aloud to make sure that the dialogue sounds as natural as I can possibly make it, while still, you know, there's a certain flow to book dialogue still. I try to kind of find a common ground between those two things, and in this case it just feels like she just went full book dialogue and didn't care about it sounding natural or realistic to the way like an actual person would talk. I mean, don't get me wrong, Rose has some total zingers. Some of her dialogue and her quotes are just spot on, and I love them to this day. But even those sometimes don't come off aloud exactly the way you think they're going to. Like, and it's weird. It seems like if it sounds unnatural out loud, then it should read unnatural as well, but like, it doesn't always. It's the weirdest thing. It's very strange. But yeah, so those were all of the things that I've kind of noticed while rereading these books. But with all that said, then what is the lesson that I kind of learned here? I feel like it's not the lesson you're expecting. The lesson I have taken away from this reread of this series is that a book doesn't need to be perfect to change somebody's life. A book doesn't need to be perfect to be somebody's favorite book of all time. A book doesn't need to be perfect to impact a person's life, to change the way they view the world. It doesn't need to be, because these books clearly aren't perfect, and yet it did all of those things for me. As I've pointed out, these books had a lot of errors and inconsistencies and just weird things that as a writer would bother me if they were in my own books. And yet, I love these books still to this day with everything I have. This read through, even with noticing all of these things, has still been so much fun. I am just as into this story today as I was back in the 8th grade when I first started reading these books. I still cried at the ends of these 2nd and 3rd books. I am just as wrapped up in the mysteries that are included in all of these books as I was the first time I read them. Given I know the answers now, but it's almost like now I'm able to look at them from a different perspective and to notice what clues she was laying out where, and it's just as much fun, just in a different way. I very sincerely feel like I will never not like these books, and part of that I think is just because of the special place they hold in my heart from all those many years ago when I first read them and how they affected me. Rose Hathaway became this huge role model for me, this person who I looked up to, whose story captivated me, whose arc taught me so many lessons about myself. Even though she is the complete opposite of me, that's almost, I think, why I was drawn to her, because she was everything I wanted to be, and yet she wasn't perfect. And so I was able to learn from her mistakes. And yeah, these books just mean the world to me, and they always will. And I guess that kind of got me thinking about my own books, because as with all writers, I sometimes have bursts of self-consciousness about my writing, a lack of confidence with my writing. Sometimes I spiral and I think this book isn't perfect enough. I haven't done enough to this book to make it the best I can, even though I've done all that I am able to do with the skills that I have. And by rereading these books, I realized my book could be so much more imperfect than I have currently made it, and it would still probably resonate with at least one person the way these books have resonated with me, which is really cool and also kind of takes some of the pressure off. Now, I'm not saying don't make your book as good as it can be, because totally, absolutely, 100% you should do your best to write the best book you can, because hello, if you can avoid having these errors and stuff that I've noticed in this book, of course you want to do that. But also, if there are mistakes, if some things slip through the cracks, if you write a story and then the next book you write is even better because you've grown as a writer, that doesn't mean the previous story was bad or that people won't connect with it. Like, they will. It's great that you're growing as a writer, but your previous work not being up to the level as your new stuff is, that doesn't mean that it's not good. It doesn't mean that readers won't enjoy it. Also, let's be real, especially for like middle grade and young adult, those readers are going to be a lot less picky about this kind of stuff than us older readers are, especially us older readers who are also writers, so we've just got that editing brain going 24/7. Back when I was in middle school and high school, I didn't even notice half of these things that I've noticed now, and So I liked the book, not even despite it, but just because it just totally went over my head. Now again, that's not to say that you can write a shitty book just because it's kids who are going to be reading it. Like, you want to write the best book you can, but again, there's just some leeway there. It's just a little bit less pressure to put on yourself. If there's an accidental typo in the final version of your book, it sucks, but it's not the end of the world. It is not going to keep that person who is going to read your book and connect to it from doing exactly that. Like, they'll do that no matter if there's a typo or there's an inconsistency that you didn't notice until it was too late. So yeah, that is what I have learned from my read through of the Vampire Academy series. Again, I'm having so much fun with it, even despite noticing these weird little things that I never noticed before. And I really hope that this kind of helps to ease any pressure that you've been feeling about needing to make your books absolutely perfect. If it did kind of help, let me know. And also tell me in the comments, what are your favorite imperfect books? You know, books that you read once upon a time that now in hindsight you're like, yeah, maybe that wasn't the best book in the world, but it still means the world to you. But yeah, so that is all I have for you today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Also, a friendly reminder, I have a Patreon. It has one single tier, the $1 or more tier, where you get a lot of really cool perks just for donating $1 a month. So if you're interested in checking that out, link is in the description down below. And finally, I hope you have a beautiful day, and I will see you next time. Bye!